for the second week of our Last Word series. I have the great honor, I'm so sorry about that. I have the great honor to introduce today Reverend Susan Candea. She is Bishop of the Central State Synod of ELCA, and that is a big, we have a diocese, the Synod is big, big, big. It is all of Kansas.
Yeah, I say it takes 4 Episcopal bishops to do what 1 Lutheran bishop does. Just saying.
I love it. I love it. Prior to being elected Bishop of the Central State Synod in 2019, Reverend Susan Candea has over 30 years of parish ministry experience and 6 years on Synod staff. She's been involved in many aspects of ministry throughout the church, including advocacy work, which is near and dear to her heart, and how actually I was introduced to her a few years back, campus ministry, youth gatherings, a little near and dear to my heart as well, community organizing, interfaith, and ecumenical work. She enjoys spending time with her 3 sons and 2 grandchildren, going on hikes and listening to audiobooks as she drives across the Synod to be with her many, many congregations. So please welcome Bishop Candea.
Thank you. Okay, well, thank you so much for the invitation to come and share with you. It was just kind of an open invitation. I don't often get that I can talk about what I want to talk about. So what I want to talk about today, and I want to leave time for questions, is in January, I, along with 16 other bishops of the ELCA, traveled to Palestine, the Holy Land, and Jordan, at the invitation of the Evangelical Lutheran Church in Jordan and the Holy Land. Don't ask me what the acronyms of that is. And the reason that we took this trip is because we have a very close relationship with that church. It's very small. They have 6 congregations, period. But also because there is something about stepping back into the Holy Land, back into where Jesus traveled in Galilee and so forth, that actually helps us to understand and get insights into how we are called to travel with Jesus. To be honest, I was nervous about the trip, even though I drive across Kansas, Missouri, flying to another place where they have, different food, and you don't have your same routine, and I really missed ice. They don't do ice. And some other things. I thought, But when I got there, I have to tell you, it was one of the most inspirational and meaningful trips I've ever taken. And one of the themes that we have in our Synod, with our congregations that we lift up, it's about traveling the way of Jesus. Big surprise, it's about Jesus. And so what I learned in these travels, I want to share with you 4 insights that I learned in the travels there that I think help us today. What does it mean to travel the way of Jesus in our own settings? So the first thing that I discovered, and I did not know this, I learned so much, and we stayed primarily in Palestine on the West Bank, is that among Palestinians, 2% or even less are Christians. So Christians in that area of the world are extremely small, percentage-wise. And yet, 49% of what we call nonprofit social ministries are Christian-based. So wrap your brain around that. 2%, and they are concerned about their church. They're concerned, just like you often hear, what's happening to mainline denominations. We're growing smaller. And they acknowledge that. And life is really rough, so many Palestinians actually leave. So they don't have the young people because of the lack of opportunities. But yet, in the midst of that, while they acknowledge that, they do incredible ministry. And it reminds me, I think there's a parable where Jesus says something about a mustard seed, that the smallest can, this huge tree that bears much fruit, right? And so it reminded me that as we travel, and there's certainly nothing wrong. Of course, we want to grow, we want to reach out, But I think sometimes we mistake that big is better, and that the goal is to be big so we can be better. The goal is to produce fruits. And the people in Palestine, like I said, 2% of the population, and the ministry organizations that they have started and continue to support service Muslims and Jews and Christians. And they have schools and hospital and an environmental center, all of this to better the lives of the people with such a small minority. Now, they don't do it on their own. They do it in collaboration, not only with other people, obviously in Palestine, but churches across the globe. I was able to be there for the ordination of the first Palestinian woman. She was ordained in the Lutheran Church. And there were over 200 clergy and bishops from around the world at her ordination. So it just made me think that what does Jesus call us to do with what we may think is small? But working together, we can make a huge impact. And let me tell you, the schools, they're the ones that parents want to send their children to, even though there's a tuition cost and it's a sacrifice, because they lift up these values of justice and peace and charity and kindness and respect in ways. The hospital there that is supported by the Lutheran Church is the only hospital that addresses pediatric children who are struggling with diabetes. And so they reach out in amazing ways. So that just really coming back and bemoaning, oh, the state of the church in the United States and poor us, it's like, wait a minute. What can we do if we take seriously this call of Jesus to travel and do what we can with the gifts and resources we have been given? Amazing, amazing, in really difficult circumstances. And one of those difficult circumstances is, and this is also as we think about traveling the way of Jesus, we as human beings, but in some cultures more so than others, we like to put up walls. There is, you may have heard, there is literally a huge 30-foot concrete wall that goes through Palestine, Jerusalem, and different places, where you cannot get from here to here without going clear around through a checkpoint and back. So families are actually separated. One of the stories that I just continues to break my heart is one of the schools that the church supports. The principal is a single mother of 3 children. She lost her husband a few months ago. She lives about 30 minutes from the school, but it takes her 2 hours to get from her home to the school because she is Palestinian. And there are certain roads that you can drive on and you can't drive on if you're Palestinian. They have different colored license plates. If you're Palestinian, you get one color. If you're an Israeli citizen, you get another color. But so for this woman to care for children at a school, she has to drive 2 hours because of the wall, because of the checkpoints, in order to fulfill this wonderful ministry, time away from her children, and at the end of the day, she has to drive 2 hours back. Now, I know it is a very complex political situation in Israel and Palestine. The tensions there, the violence, all of that is very real. And we often think that the best way to deal with our fear, the best way to deal with people that we feel threatened because they may have some different ways, is to put up walls. And we put up walls in a lot of different ways, my friends. This was, I mean, seeing that wall and physically, and even a 30-foot concrete wall with barbed wire on top. And I thought, how could anybody even get to where the barbed wire is? And is that really making that area of the world safer? It actually has the opposite effect, because the more you divide people, the more you cut them off, the less they're able to have relationships and get to know one another as neighbors and as fellow human beings. And again, when I bring that back to what did Jesus do, again, I think there are a few things in the Bible, in the New Testament, that talk about in Christ, right? There's neither male nor female, Jew or Greek, slave or free, that when Jesus came, he sat down with, in fact, the story for this coming Sunday, I think you all use a lectionary, working on my sermon, the Samaritan woman at the well. The Samaritans and the Jewish people were enemies. They were enemies. They did not trust each other. They fought. And yet Jesus goes into Samaritan territory, has a conversation with a woman, and she invites her neighbors to understand that God is spirit, that we can't put God in a box. We can't wall God over on our side while God is not on their side. Again, I recognize that there are a lot of complications, but it was really startling to see how we as human beings, how much we rely on walls, thinking that makes us safe. And Jesus calls us to a different way of life, a way of life that we are reconciled. So small doesn't mean insignificant. Walls are not the way we travel with Jesus, but speaking up is. I told you the story of the woman, the principal, and I just wanted to go say will you just cut a hole or something and let this woman get to work, in some reasonable time. There are other stories. Again, there's so much division, and there are laws that separate people. The hospital that we support, they do a wonderful thing. They have a mobile mammogram van so that they can actually go into communities and women can have access to needed tests. But when a woman has a mammogram and she may find out that there's something she needs to be tested for, in order for her to travel to that hospital, she has to go to the government, get a permit that enables her to pass through the checkpoint to go to the hospital to get treatment. Now imagine you've just been told that you have a diagnosis of cancer. That's hard enough to deal with. On top of that, you have to go through all these hoops and hope that the government officials can be responsive so that you can get to the hospital. I don't care where you're at in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, whatever. That is not right. It's not right. And if people do not speak up, then the not right continues. We visited a center, a international human rights organization that actually tracks the human rights violations of Israelis. And this is not anti-Semitic. This is not against Jewish people. We're talking Israeli soldiers and so forth. And so we're talking to the director of this, and quite a few human rights violations, as you can imagine. There's a lot that goes on. And asked why he did this. He himself is an Israeli Jew who is tracking the human rights violations of other Israeli Jews. And he said, because my grandparents survived the Holocaust. And that happened because people did not speak up. And I'm not going to be part of a generation that does not speak up when there is injustice. I don't know if it's true in Episcopal circles. I'm guessing maybe there's a touch of this. But what I often hear in some of my circles with some of my congregations is that the church should not be involved in politics. Keep them separate. We need to focus on Jesus, and all the political stuff, that's over here. Well, first of all, Jesus was a pretty political guy. I mean, he came and it was the reign of God. And second, how can we be silent in whatever arena when our neighbors are hurting? How can we be silent? Now, what is the solution? I mean, there's actually, different people have different opinions about the whole situation in Palestine. Should it be a one-state solution, a two-state solution? Again, very complex. But to not say anything when people are being hurt. Another horrific story that I thought, this cannot be the way for us to not say stop. That they found some of the Palestinian young men, teenagers or whatever, they have started carrying their last will and testament in their pockets. That if something would happen to them, their parents would have a last word for them. And that happened a week before we got there. A 15-year-old boy was shot. And they found in his pocket what he hoped would happen, and it wasn't to get shot on the streets. Our neighbors, our siblings in Christ, God's beloved, should not be living in fear. Again, regardless, and sometimes I think we use the thing, it's complicated, it's messy, we should just not get involved. But again, if we don't speak up, who will? And so for me, traveling the way of Jesus says, even if I have a small single voice, I need to speak up. Not in a mean way, not in a disrespectful way, not in a way that just becomes a bully shouting at the other side, which is often what we do. But in a way that stands up and says that the way God calls all of us to live is with respect and peace and love and justice. And that's not this. Speak up. One more story about, which I love this story. I wish I could show you a picture. So his name is Father Chaucer. He's an Anglican bishop. And he is the classic, his white beard goes down to like his waist, and he has a black cassock, and he runs a school. There's a school that brings, again, Jewish, Muslim, and Christian students together to learn ways of peace. He had a really hard time. He himself is a boy. His hometown was taken over when Israeli occupation came, and he had to flee his town, and then it was just this horrendous story. But instead of being angry, he became a priest, and he was determined to work. And so he could not get a permit to get his school built, because again, government hoops and all that. So this was pre-9/11. He flew to the United States. He went to the house of the Secretary of State. I don't remember who it was there. Knocked on the door, which would never be able to happen, and did not go away until the Secretary of State agreed to intercede so that he could build a school so that children could come and learn together. I'm like, wow. Again, I don't think they'd let you near, but he is a voice and what he's done. So how can we not speak up? How can we not speak up? But then finally, you think life is so hard, and it just breaks my heart to see the people struggle and the stories about the children and the division and kids that have never seen, the sea because they can't get from one side to the other. It's just awful. And in the midst of that, and certainly some people are very angry, which is, I think, the seed of the violence. But over and over again, what we saw was not only resilience, but hope and joy. these people, I never felt unsafe. And while they owned what was going on, and they named clearly the obstacles and the challenges and the injustices, there wasn't this negativity, there wasn't this whining, there was this determination and joy. My favorite times were going to the schools and watching the children dance. And our presiding bishop, Bishop Eaton, was there for the ordination of this woman and went with us to the school. And I leaned over and I said, that's a problem in our churches. We don't dance enough. So they are able to deal with very challenging living conditions with a very small minority of people, with huge obstacles, with joy. Which reminds us of this way of Jesus. It's about joy. How have we lost that sense of joy in the church? We are so busy arguing and fighting and, making sure this is right and that is right and whatever. And I think Jesus says, just dance with me. And the abundance, the food, oh my goodness. Again, probably from our standpoint, these are people living in poverty. There are very few economic opportunities, and yet the food every time was like, in fact, I got to the point, could we just have more of a buffet? Because if I could choose, I could put a little bit on my plate, but if they brought my plate to me, it was like, the best one was, we went to this restaurant in our travels, and so you got used to it. They start out with all these different kinds of salads and pita bread. But that's just the first course. So we learned, take a little. And then they brought out the soup. Okay, so then we did the soup. And then they brought out spaghetti. And I thought, I didn't know spaghetti was okay, so that we're having spaghetti today. And then they brought out the meat and the potatoes and vegetables. And then they brought out dessert. I'm like, there's so much. But they live their lives with a sense of abundance and joy and fulfillment. And I thought, could we perhaps learn to do it that way? So that's why I wanted to share with you what I learned about traveling the way of Jesus, gave me a different perspective so that I could come back and do the ministry and help congregations and people realize it's not just that we have things so well, but we really can learn from others what it means to be people who are deeply rooted in Christ, who trust Christ to the point that there is joy in the midst of the tears. So, how are we doing?
We are good.
Okay, I want to be mindful of time.
We do have a few minutes.
Yeah, a few minutes.
For questions, if anyone has a question, and I'll play Phil Donahue, and I'll run around with my microphone if you've got a question.
I was curious about the principle that you were talking about. If she wanted to, I assume it was a she,
Yes.
would she be able to move closer to the school?
There are all kinds of rules and, things she'd have to get a permit to be able to do that. And part of what's happened in Palestine is that, again, the intention was, I believe, really good, to give Jewish people who had been displaced a home. But now, if you are Jewish, have any Jewish, you can receive and get homes and land free. Well, those homes and land have been occupied by Palestinians. So for a Palestinian to be able to move, it is not the same thing as a Jewish person. And again, yep, and it's all about whether you're Palestinian or not.
Other questions? I have one.
Sure.
Before we wrap up. How did your trip to the Holy Land change your relationship with God, your prayer life, your experience of the divine personally?
Okay. That's great. Thank you for asking that. To be honest, as a bishop traveling around with congregations that are struggling, the pandemic has not been easy, and attendance, and there's also a bit of crankiness that happens. I found it was easier for me just to kind of get sucked into the negativity myself. And I found myself, even though I very much feel called to do what I'm doing, I found myself doing this call with a sense of almost despair, and realized how much I was taking in from all around me, because I couldn't fix it. I couldn't change things. And so I was just feeling so weighted down by that. And again, I really wasn't looking forward to the trip. I was like, 10 days, I've got a busy schedule, da. And when I went and just immersed myself and let go of this, it was like God just lightened my heart. And Christ reminded me, it's about me, and this is what it means to travel with me. And it just helped me shift out of the kind of discouragement and frustration and just tiredness that I felt, to having, I just felt lighter. And we even, at the end of the trip, the bishops, there were some dancers, they taught us a few dances. Do not ask me to, I could barely get the feet and then the, whatever. But we were laughing, and it was just like, okay, this is what. So that's what it did for me personally. And I think that's why, because we did not go on a tourist trip. We visited very few holy sites. It really was a pilgrimage to talk with the people. But sometimes getting out of our own stuff, we don't realize how limited that our view becomes, and seeing things from people's different perspectives. And I think that can happen not just with a trip overseas, but I think it happens when we get out of our own comfort zones and we start interacting with people that maybe they are a little different from us. So that's what it did for me personally. So I came back exhausted, but a different kind of exhaustion. And now just feel so much more energized in my call. So it is different, yeah.
Thank you.
Oh,
Thank
you're
you.
welcome. Thank you. I really
lovely.
appreciate the opportunity. I've started doing this in the Synod to talk about how this has impacted me, and sharing with my Synod. And we're gearing up. Our assembly in June is going to be about traveling the way of Jesus. So.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
Beautiful.
Well, thank you all.
Thank you.
Thanks for the
very
soup,
much.
whoever made the soup.
It's delicious, isn't it? We have some good cooks here. So next week, we will be having our representative from the Sikh temple, who's going to be coming and sharing his story of what matters to him and around his faith. So I encourage you to come back. We do need some soup next week. Nobody signed up, I don't think, for next week. So if somebody could sign up to bring soup, that would be great. And I think that is all. Go in peace to love and serve the